Hey there, students. Tom Richey, and I tell you what, I just got my new mask today, and I'm really proud of it. But I just wanted to show it to y'all. And at some point, I'm gonna have to like talk and drink tea and all of that kind of stuff. But love my new Baby Yoda mask. It took a little while to get here. I didn't realize when I ordered it, I was coming all the way from China. So just really glad to have that. But we've got a nice social distance from each other. So let's go ahead and get to it. Now, this is our fourth APUSH prep webinar. Now, we are going to take the weekend off. Now, by the weekend, I mean just Friday and Saturday nights. Okay, so we will take Friday and Saturday off, and then we will be back on Sunday night, and we'll be going Sunday to Thursday. Okay, so just keep in mind, we're going to take Friday and Saturday off. Then Sunday, we are back every night until the exam. Okay, so this one will close out the week. We'll take a couple days off, and then we will be right back. So our focus area this evening is going to be on the time period that I call the Jeffersonian Republic. This is that period from 1800 to 1824. So we're going to go through the election of from the election of Jefferson through the era of good feeling. Okay, so as far as that goes, any specific questions you have, make a note of that. Now we see that my friends at the Bill of Rights Institute will share a link to the Google document that I'm working on. Okay, so we're getting a bit of lag here. My apologies for that. Let's see here. Internet speed is okay. It looks like it's improving a little bit, but let me just run in and make sure that all unnecessary tabs are being closed and all of that kind of stuff. How are we doing now? Okay, actually, it looks like we might be okay. Let's see how we're doing here. All right, so what do y'all, so Jefferson, okay, so let's go ahead. We can start a little bit out of time period. Hopefully the quality of the broadcast is is improving. I'm sorry about that. Sometimes the internet can be variable when we're doing this online teaching. So y'all just keep us updated about the broadcast quality. And let me just tune in there. Actually, it looks like we might be okay, it looks like everything's working. So, it may just not be with the clarity that we're used to most of the time. But my apologies for that, or Northland Cable or whoever's providing the internet, right? Okay, so the 1796 election. Well, Jefferson lost the 1796 election because he got less electoral votes than John Adams. Okay, so what we want to understand is that the 1796 election, hey, Sean Patrick, good to see you here. The 1796 election is the first, still very low. Okay, so the first contested election in the history of the United States in terms of having the the Federalists and the Republicans. So John Adams got more electoral votes than Thomas Jefferson. And so what we'll notice, what we want to think about is 1796 and 1800 were both, so 1796 presidential election. These were both very close elections. Okay, these were both very close elections. And, let's see kind of what changed here. Okay, so let's see what changed from 1796 to 1800. All right, so let's go ahead and share our screen here. And let's see, so I'm going to share the screen. And let's take a little look here. I mean, the thing is, let's think about also why he won the 1800 presidential election. Okay, so when we look at this, we've got John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Now, the big thing here is New York. Okay, so when we look at New York, we see that New York and New England, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. So all of these states, the more north and the more east you go, the more Federalist you are. The further south and the further west, you're going to see more Republicans. Okay, so the further north and the further east, more Federalist; the further south, the further west, more Republican. Now, I think that this also, gets us thinking in terms of, why the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so when we think about that why the Louisiana Purchase, what we want to think about is that certainly Jefferson benefited politically from the Louisiana Purchase. So with that, we'll go ahead and let's see. So we're going to go ahead and look at the 1800 election, and going from there, let's see. So we'll go over to 1800, and you see that the difference here, okay, the difference here is going to be New York. I mean, basically, with a few exceptions here. Now, you see the Federalists got some electors in Pennsylvania. This is a time when a lot of states still divided their presidential electors by the composition of the legislature. Now, remember, only 48 states give winner take all today, that Nebraska and Maine both have a system for dividing electoral votes. But you can see here the biggest decisive factor here is the state of New York. Aaron Burr brings the state of New York into play here. Now, as far as that, in 1796, was Burr Jefferson's running mate? Let me just note. Yeah, so Burr was Jefferson's running mate both times. But in 1800, Aaron Burr is able to flip New York for Jefferson, or was it for Jefferson? Because remember, in 1800, you had this election that ended in a tie that went to the House of Representatives. All right, so that's something that you want to note as well, that Aaron Burr ends up not yielding the presidency to Thomas Jefferson, because at that time, basically, the original Constitution did not anticipate the party system. And so what happened here is that Aaron Burr, who was on the ticket with Jefferson, all of the Jeffersonians, they went in and they voted for Jefferson and Burr, whereas the Federalists, all of them voted for Adams. Okay, so what we see here is you see there Jefferson and Burr both getting the same amount of votes. That Adams, what happened here was Pinckney was Adams' intended running mate. And so all of the Federalist electors voted for John Adams, and then one of them voted for Charles C. Pinckney, and then one voted for John Jay. Remember the Federalist Papers, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And so with that, we see that the Federalists went in and they said, okay, we need to make sure that our presidential candidate has one more vote. The Jeffersonians weren't going to take any chances, okay? They weren't going to take any chances here at all. And so they did the same, but then Aaron Burr's like, you know what? I'm just gonna sit this one out. We're gonna see what happens. We're gonna let this go to the House like the Constitution said. Now, what happens here is that then a lot of Federalists, what they wanted to do here is a lot of Federalists voted for Aaron Burr. Okay, so what happened is that people who were supporting the Federalist Party, they were voting for Aaron Burr. Now, Alexander Hamilton actually gets into a letter writing campaign, writes some of his Federalist friends about this, because he says, look, y'all are really going the wrong route here. Hamilton wasn't the biggest fan of Jefferson. He didn't love Jefferson, but he really hated Burr. Okay, so Hamilton said, look, I've worked with Jefferson before. Jefferson, is not quite the ideologue that people think he is. Jefferson's actually kind of pragmatic, which is, we can definitely see that during his presidency. There are some times where Jefferson makes decisions that are not necessarily the decision he would make on principle. And so Hamilton says that Jefferson can be reasoned with a little bit. Those of you who think that Burr would be in a better situation, not so much. In fact, I was talking with somebody the other day about impeachment, and actually, somebody that was a Democrat who said that, well, what if the impeachment of Donald Trump had gone through? Then Mike Pence would be the president. Mike Pence, somebody who has got very bona fide conservative credentials, where Donald Trump tends to, sometimes be here, sometimes be there. And so this is the sort of thing that, Alexander Hamilton tells his friends, Burr's going to be a lot harder to work with than Jefferson. And so going from there, he ends up swinging it to Jefferson, convincing enough of his Federalist colleagues that Aaron Burr is dangerous. Now, if you were ever wondering about the context of the Burr-Hamilton duel, there you go, that Hamilton eventually became aware of what Aaron Burr was doing. And so Jefferson wins that 1800 election. And let's just make a little note here. Okay, so we will get to the War of 1812. Now, what we want to note here is let's go into our Google document that has been shared, and I'm going to go in here and make a few notes. Now, remember, you are more than welcome to keep these Google documents. You are more than welcome to print them, to refer to them. Remember, my recommendation is that any notes that you're going to have on hand during the exam really should be printed. I don't know if I would have, online notes that I was looking at. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look. And I've got a few things here. Now, one thing to note, I would say that, Angela, that gender roles during the early during 1800 to 1824, we're not really going to see a change in that on the AP exam. Okay, so what you're going to see, like, first of all, when you look into gender in U.S. history, you're going to see Republican motherhood during the American Revolution, and then you're really not going to see a lot on that front until the antebellum period, where first of all you've got the girls working in Lowell, Massachusetts. Okay, so the girls working in Lowell, Massachusetts, they are working in the factories. Now, also middle class women. That we're going to see with middle class women, that they are then getting into the suffrage movement. And it's not really going to be until about the time of Reconstruction that we start to see like protections of property for married women, that married women, when they get married, get to maintain control of their own property. Whereas, when a woman got married, in the early national period, her property would go to her husband, except for her land, that her husband would need permission to sell her land. That would be, so there are some things here, but I don't think that, we see a lot of a lot on the gender front during this 1800, 1824 period. But definitely be on the lookout during the antebellum period. And remember the development of Republican motherhood during the, in the wake of the American Revolution. So let's think about this. We want to think about a revolution of 1800. Okay, that's a question that's often asked. It's like, to what extent Jefferson called the 1800 election a revolution. Okay, so let's think in terms of change. Okay, so when we think about change and continuity. Okay, so let's think about changes and continuities as a result of Jefferson's election. Okay, so first of all, we would say that one of the things that changed with Jefferson, Jefferson said something about a wise and frugal government. Okay, so a wise and frugal government. Now, when we look at some things here, is that Jefferson, and I'm going to give you some specific examples. Okay, so Jefferson noted a wise and frugal government. What does he mean by that? Okay, so when we look here, Jefferson cut the federal budget, especially the military budget. Okay, so the military budget, and made progress in paying down the national debt. Okay, now this is very important here, because when Jefferson and Hamilton were debating, one of the biggest things about Jefferson and Hamilton is that Hamilton said a national debt is a national blessing. Okay, that a national debt is something that is okay, you just maintain it. Okay, so you maintain that debt, and then you maintain it and just kind of pay on it. As long as you're making the minimum payments, you're good. And some of y'all, you'll manage debt. All of you will manage debt at a certain point when you're an adult. And the thing is, as long as you're able to make your minimum payments and it's not hurting you, it's not necessarily something that's going to break you to have debt. But at the same time, when we're thinking about, if you can't make your minimum payments, that can become a problem when things change. Jefferson saw debt as something that was a constant menace. Okay, he didn't see a national debt as like, let's make the minimum payments, kind of maintain it, we're good. Jefferson wanted to pay it down, and he made a lot of progress in paying it down. We also want to note, so while Jefferson cut the budget, he also discontinued the collection of Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey. Okay, so Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey is done. You know, Jefferson boasted in his second inaugural address that he had eliminated internal taxes. Okay, so he had eliminated internal taxes. He asked, what farmer, what laborer, what mechanic ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States? Okay, and I mean, that just sounds so beautiful to me, right? So Jefferson, you know, Jefferson's second inaugural address. Okay, yeah. So I just love the direct quote here. So ever sees, let's see. Okay, so where is that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, see, I've got it. Okay, so it may be the pleasure and pride of an American to ask what farmer, what mechanic, what laborer, what laborer ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States. Okay, and so Jefferson, now, if you think about this, something that we can put into context is that that Jefferson is asking here, you know, in terms of, let's go back to the Stamp Act. Remember, the Stamp Act, you know, riled people up because it was an internal tax. And when we think about the Whiskey Rebellion during the 1790s, this was a tax rebellion against an internal tax. Okay, so when you think about this, that Jefferson is you know, this is something, let's see. So I'm going to do just 2AA, the second inaugural address. Oh, wait, yeah. Second inaugural address. And so with that, we want to make a note of this. Now, of course, then we see that the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so the Louisiana Purchase, okay, so tested Jefferson's constitutional Okay, so as far as that goes, what we want to note here about the Louisiana Purchase, that it tested Jefferson's strict constructionist resolve. Now, first of all, to really understand this, because frankly, I see this as kind of minor, that when we're thinking about Jefferson's strict construction, it's really one of these things that Jefferson is so strict constructionist almost to a fault, okay? That Jefferson says if it's not specifically enumerated in the Constitution, the government shouldn't have that power. So Jefferson's personal viewpoint of the Louisiana Purchase is that it's a land purchase, and the Constitution does not does not authorize the federal government to purchase land. So what Jefferson wanted, he said, we need to amend the Constitution, make sure the government has this power. Jefferson and Madison, when you look at Madison's bonus bill, when you look at Madison's bonus bill veto, you can see that Madison also feels this way, that every time the government wants to pursue a novel power, that it needs the consent of the people and the states, okay? So it needs the consent of the people and the states in order to get permission to do that. So Jefferson wanted to get permission from the American people to do it in the form of a constitutional amendment. And so then Jefferson's colleagues are like, look, we're not going to get a constitutional amendment. New England, the Northeast, is not going to go along with it, because what's happening with the Louisiana Purchase is that, New York and New England, they're going to lose. The Northeast is going to lose political clout, and it's going to guarantee, this agrarianism that is really more like the South and the West. And the South and the West are largely going to be in an alliance together throughout most of the antebellum period, most of the early 19th century before the Civil War. And so Jefferson yields to his party and says, okay, we will let the people consent to the Louisiana Purchase through their representatives in Congress. Now, here we go that I want to note here that as an interpretive element here, if you're thinking about you want to defend Jefferson, it's pretty easy to do, okay? Because when you think about this, the jump that you have to take to say that the national bank is constitutional because, well, there are financial powers in the Constitution. There you go. In the Constitution, it says quite clearly there's a treaty-making power. And so it's not a very big jump to say, okay, it's a treaty between France and the United States, and we're purchasing land as part of a treaty. Basically, though, the whole treaty is purchasing land. So Jefferson was a little bit uneasy, but really he was in some ways a victim of his own inflexibility. But then again, Jefferson did show himself to be someone who could be flexible. And so when we look at this, we see a wise and frugal government. Now, one thing we want to note a few continuities. Okay, so first of all, when we consider that, let's say that, no, it's not going to look like I don't think I can. We're not in Word, so I can't like cut this or anything like that. So actually, you know what I can do? Okay, so I can put something, insert row above, and then I can put these two together. All right, so that I can do. All right, so with that, let's kind of think about this. So first of all, we want to think in terms of foreign policy. Okay, so in terms of foreign policy, Jefferson maintained, or tried to maintain, tried his best to maintain, I would say, tried his best to maintain Washington's neutrality policy. Okay, so policy which he had opposed as Secretary of State. So the presidency gives someone a different vantage point. Okay, so when we're looking at Jefferson's first inaugural address, not the second one, let's see if we can just run in here and just put a 1 here, and it worked. Okay, so peace. Okay, and this is actually something that we see in Jefferson's first inaugural address that people actually tend to think that Washington said. They tend to give to Washington when Jefferson said, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Okay, so entangling alliances with none, this is from Jefferson's first inaugural address. So Jefferson's first inaugural address. So if we're thinking about continuities with Jefferson in the so-called Revolution of 1800, it was not a revolution in terms of foreign policy. We want to understand that the embargo, okay, so this cursed, oh, grab me, okay, so this cursed, oh, grab me. Okay, so this cursed, oh, grab me, as it says in that cartoon with the snapping turtle. The embargo was an attempt to keep the United States out of the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, so Jefferson understand that the embargo has its roots in the neutrality policy of George Washington that Jefferson is trying to hold on to. So with that, we also want to note in terms of the Marshall Court. Okay, so when we think about the Marshall Court, okay, so the Marshall Court led by John Marshall, a Federalist, basically, threatened Jefferson's, denied Jefferson control, or I would say here the Jeffersonians control over the judiciary. Okay, so when we think about that, that the Jeffersonians control the judiciary. Now remember here that Marbury v. Madison. Okay, so Marbury v. Madison. We see here with this decision. Okay, so in Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court ruled that it had the authority to interpret the Constitution and strike down federal laws. Okay, Jefferson believed this power belonged to the states. Okay, so belonged to the states. All right, so basically the thing is, we note that John Marshall was somebody who was, who was a fan of a strong central government. Okay, so we're going to note here that the McCulloch versus Maryland decision. Okay, now Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland are two of your 15 cases for AP U.S. government and politics. Okay, so so the McCulloch versus Maryland decision upheld the constitutionality of the national bank. Okay, and of course that is the doctrine of implied powers. So when we're thinking about this, we want to think about in terms of continuity and change, that the Jeffersonians, Jefferson's election, results in continuity in some ways, change in others. Okay, so another thing to note here, just as a nuance, is that the Jeffersonians did not try to destroy the national bank. Jefferson didn't make a war on the bank. They did allow it to expire in 1811 during Madison's presidency. Of course, it was brought back after the War of 1812. Okay, so we would note here that we would say here that the Jeffersonians did not make a Jackson-style war against the bank. Okay, so against the Bank of the United States, but allowed the charter to expire in 1811. Okay, so basically the charter expired in 1811. It's going to come back after the War of 1812. So we want to note those ways, like if we're looking at this, we want to understand those interpretive elements. So remember, in terms of change, we see that, that the Louisiana Purchase is, of course, adding land, and also changes the way that the Jeffersonians are looking at the Constitution. That the Constitution is something, now that they're in power, they can stretch out just a little bit. Okay, the audio is okay, so the audio is working, and as far as that goes, you know what, I'm going to I think while I'm screencasting, I'll go ahead and maybe shut off my video. And again, sorry about the situation here. Let me try shutting off my video and see if that helps. Okay, so you should still be able to hear me. And so going from that, now going into the embargo, okay, so let's just take a quick look at what's going on with, and again, sorry about the internet connection. That is something that we're not really going to be able to do anything about, but let's see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to talk about the embargo and the War of 1812, okay? So as far as that, oh, maybe do they have cool symbols? Yeah, Addie, that is a great great question there. Okay, so with that, let's take a look here and get into the Jeffersonian Republic, talk a little bit about the War of 1812. And hopefully we've decided if they've got cool symbols. Okay, so it's not, okay, so fixed it. All right, so as far as that goes, let me go ahead and put the screen, I'm going to screen share, and that should help with things. And again, that's our apologies here, I guess, with this online, any form of online teaching, we got to work around this whenever we can. And so going over this, we want to note that this is the period, like when we think about what I call the trials of the Jeffersonians, the embargo and the War of 1812. Now, you notice that Jefferson's first term went very, very well. Okay, Jefferson's first term was a great success by any measurement. And then we get here to the War of 1812. Now, we need to talk about the American system in the context of the War of 1812. Okay, so what we want to understand here is that before the War of 1812, you've got this Jeffersonian economic model where the United States economy is operating almost exclusively about the same as it did in the colonial period, just with free trade. Okay, so you've got free trade with that. Okay, so you see raw materials and finished goods. Now, Jefferson had written before that, we, in his notes on the state of Virginia, that why should we even have manufacturing in the United States? That should not, that should not be something that we want to, pursue. Manufacturing, not so much. And so that's something that when we see things happening, though, in response to impressment, that Jefferson says, I mean, after you've got British ships that are firing on American ships, such as the Chesapeake Leopard affair, that Jefferson wanted to maintain neutrality. He wanted to avoid war. And of course, that goes into the Embargo Act. So the trade embargo of 1807, where the embargo bans all trade. And so Jefferson's just trying, he means for this to be temporary. There are all kinds of connections that we can make here in terms of the embargo and what's going on right now, that we see that all of these measures that we're taking with the coronavirus, that these measures are said to be temporary. We're told that if we go along with them, if we practice all of the things that the government's telling us, that we're going to see some good results, okay? But with the Embargo Act, a similar thing, that you see that some people, especially in New England, they were not very happy with the embargo, and they made nicknames for it. And of course, one of those, my favorite here, oh, this cursed oh grab me. And we see here that somebody's trying to smuggle out some superfine, whatever that is. And we see here that oh grab me is embargo spelled backwards. Okay, so understand that the embargo represents a massive failure in Jefferson's presidency. It's typically seen as a failure. Now, the embargo was technically constitutional, but at the same time, it's something that really went against Jefferson's principles. Okay, so this is the thing that, there was a crisis and Jefferson decided to use economic coercion in order to deal with this crisis. Jefferson was typically a fan of freedom, but he chose something that made people less free. And his Treasury Secretary advised him. Jefferson was considering the embargo. Albert Gallatin, his Treasury Secretary, said, governmental prohibitions do always more mischief than had been calculated, and it is not without much hesitation that a statesman should hazard to regulate the concerns of individuals as if he could do it better than themselves. I'll just let that quote sit there for a little while and we can all contemplate it a little bit. Casually sips tea. All right, so as far as that goes, one thing we want to note here, now let's not get in a hurry. This isn't the Gilded Age, okay, but an unintended consequence. And I always like this thing to be able to do its little animation that I designed. Oh, actually, it's not animated there. Okay, so as far as that goes, an unintended consequence of the embargo is that the Northeast began investing more heavily in textile manufacturing. And that is, if we're thinking about gender roles, as somebody asked, this is laying for the foundation for the girls working in the mills at Lowell, Massachusetts, that this is an unintended consequence of Jefferson's embargo and the War of 1812. Now, note that Madison takes over, okay? So James Madison takes over as the fourth president of the United States, and this is something that the situation has not changed. And we see here, though, the composition of the House of Representatives has changed. Now we've got here young Henry Clay and young John C. Calhoun, who are in the 12th Congress, and both of them are advocating for war. These are the war hawks that are coming up on the War of 1812. Now, the Battle of Tippecanoe could be great context for the War of 1812, looking into what are the causes here. So we've been over, most people are familiar with the impressment, but one thing that we want to note here is that after the Battle of Tippecanoe, when the fallen natives were disarmed, they were using rifles that were made in, or muskets or whatever these were, they were using guns that had been made in Canada. Yeah, I don't want to speculate that they were rifle bored or not, in case anybody would be able to prove me wrong. So with that, these guns were made in Canada, and the United, a lot of Americans believe that the British are, intentionally inciting and arming Indians on the Western frontier, that this is happening on purpose. So we see here the impressment of sailors, the cutting off of trade, and also the inciting of Indians on the Western frontier. Now, in 1812, you see that there is a coalition forming here, that Federalists decide that they are going to support another candidate, basically a disaffected Republican, DeWitt Clinton. So we see that things are kind of starting. Now, Madison still gets a pretty handy electoral victory. Note, Vermont is voting differently because Vermont's not a state that, relies on trade quite as much, right? And so we can see here that the War of 1812 doesn't go so well. Washington is burned down. Dolly Madison, thank you, Dolly Madison, for saving the iconic portrait of George Washington during the War of 1812. Now, what we want to understand about the War of 1812 is the way that it ended, okay? So the Treaty of Ghent, the Hartford Convention, and the Battle of New Orleans. These things are going on very, very close together. And so the Treaty of Ghent, the Hartford Convention, and the Battle of New Orleans. Now, the Hartford Convention meets, they don't realize that the war is almost over, okay? The Treaty of Ghent is signed on December 24th, 1814. This was before the transatlantic telegraph, so it's going to be some time, couple months before they know that this has happened. And so meanwhile, the Hartford Convention is meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, and they are getting together, these delegates from New England states, they're getting together to propose amendments to the Constitution, kind of like an unofficial Article 5 Convention of States. And so they get together here to propose amendments. And so we see here New England Federalists, they are there to amend the Constitution. They want to change some things like 2/3 of Congress to declare war. Frankly, I don't think that's a bad idea. 2/3 to admit new states, not a bad idea. No conscription. Now, this is very interesting. We see that the New England Federalists, they're the ones now who want to amend the Constitution in order to reduce the size and scope of the federal government. So often the party out of power is what, is what's going to, is the party that's going to want to limit government. And so one thing here that we'll note is that where the Hartford Convention made a serious PR blunder is that they said that we're going to recommend some amendments to the Constitution. All right, if they would have stopped there, not so bad, okay? But what happened here is they decided that they weren't only going to amend the Constitution, propose amendments, but they were going to say that if these amendments are not adopted, okay, then we're going to go another route here, that if these amendments are not adopted, then we are going to meet again in Boston 6 months from now. And, we will do whatever it says here. This meeting in Boston will have such powers and instructions as the exigency of a crisis so momentous may require. Sounds like code for secession. And certainly when you look at this political cartoon, what we see here, we see the New Englanders who are looking like they are about to jump into the arms of the King of England. And so going from there, we see that the Battle of New Orleans also takes place. Now, the War of 1812, by and large, was a disaster for the United States. I mean, there's really no other way to slice that it was something of a disaster for the United States. And going from there, we see that, the most memorable things that tend to happen, we tend to remember the first and last part of something. So the Battle of New Orleans, which is the last battle of the War of 1812, it's something that ends in a very decisive British defeat, okay? And so you see here just a completely lopsided victory here for Andrew Jackson. Okay, so a completely lopsided victory. America, we see here that there is a rise of nationalism. Okay, so we want to look at that as a consequence here. And then 1816, we see that James Monroe is elected president by a very wide margin, margin. Now, the Federalist Party, as a result of the War of 1812, because of its association with the Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party ceases to be nationally competitive. But remember, as a result of the War of 1812, the idea of a purely agricultural economy was no longer viable. Okay, but we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. It's not like the Gilded Age is going to start right then. So with that, James Monroe's election began an era of good feelings that gave the nation a short break from partisan politics. You can see here in 1820 that there is the election of James Monroe to the presidency. Okay, so with that, that gets us through the War of 1812. Now looking at the consequences of the War of 1812. So with that, so the impact of the War of 1812, we see, of course, so westward migration, that's another thing there without the British interference out there. So it is, we can say that this made some contributions to the market revolution. So going from that, if we think about the War of 1812, okay, so continuity and change after the War of 1812, okay? So we would see here when we're thinking about continuity and change, we have, first of all, Henry Clay's American system, okay? So Henry Clay's American system, I always say NIP, okay? Because it is, we've got one, a national bank, internal improvements, and a protective tariff, okay? So national bank, internal improvements, and protective tariff. Now, what we'll note here is the second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816, okay? So 1816, right after the War of 1812. Internal improvements. Now, what we're gonna note here is Madison vetoed Calhoun's bonus bill, okay? Now, the thing is, what we want to understand about Calhoun, we typically associate Calhoun as a Southern sectionalist and and a staunch advocate of states' rights. But Calhoun, when he was younger, was more of a nationalist, okay? We actually, they have John C. Calhoun, like the 3-volume biography of Calhoun published in the 1950s said, it was like John C. Calhoun nationalist, John C. Calhoun nullifier, and John C. Calhoun sectionalist. Those were the 3 parts of that 3-volume biography by Charles Wiltse. So Madison vetoed Calhoun's bonus bill on the grounds that it went beyond the powers of, given to the federal government by the Constitution. Okay, so, and then we note here that James Monroe and Andrew Jackson made similar vetoes. Okay, so similar vetoes. Basically, the strict constructionists believed that the only case where you can fund internal improvements is it something that's truly going through the United States. Okay, so when we think about, for example, the National Road. Okay, so National Road A-push. Let's see here. I don't know. Okay, now that's going to Quizlet, but the National Road. So as far as that goes, come on now. Okay, so we see here that you do see the Cumberland Road, which went all the way. Okay, so this is something that went all the way from, you see here, Cumberland over here in Maryland, went all the way to Illinois. So we can see here that this road is going through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 states. So this would meet a criteria for something that this is something that is truly interstate commerce. Okay, so when we look though at the Maysville Road, okay, so the Maysville Road veto. Okay, so this is something, as we're looking forward, we're seeing that this is something that Andrew Jackson vetoed it. He said that this is something that is going from, this is basically going from Lexington, Kentucky to Maysville, Kentucky. And, although it's something, now this goes into Henry Clay's idea that even though this is in one state, this is something that it could, Henry Clay would say that it's something that helps the national economy. That's his American system. He wanted to develop the West economically. Jackson said, this is in one state. All right, this is in one state. So therefore, it's not national. And the other thing is that Jackson, like Jefferson, wanted to pay down the national debt. During Jackson's time, the national debt actually went down to zero. And so that's something that we see, that internal improvements are something that are very contentious. Okay, so we see here that that Madison said, I think internal improvements are a good idea, but they're not in the Constitution. So that's where Madison is coming from, still with some of his strict constructionism. So even though Madison comes around on the bank, because that was something that was necessary, we've got here. So the tariff of 1816, okay, was, the tariff of 1816 was the first tariff with rates that could be properly defined, so properly defined as protective, okay? So be as protective, being in excess of the requirement for federal revenue. Okay, so as far as that goes, let's make sure that we're noting here that we're thinking about the two types of tariffs. Okay, so we think about this, and then we'll say here that the nullification crisis. Okay, so the nullification crisis, in response, was a protest against the tariff of 1828. Okay, so 1828. So tariff policies went down after that. Okay, so tariffs went down substantially after that. Okay, for the next and remain so low for most of the antebellum period. So we want to note that tariffs were a contentious thing here. All right. So tariffs were, a bit of a contentious project. And so looking at this, let's just get that. Let's say. All right. And so one thing I want to note here is we want to get into the difference between a revenue tariff and a protective tariff. Okay. So a revenue tariff versus a protective tariff. So this is something that we want to make sure that we understand. Okay, so this is collected with the sole purpose of raising revenue. Okay, so raising revenue for the federal government. Okay, now a protective tariff collected with the intention of protecting American industry, American man, so protecting the protecting American manufacturing from foreign competition. Okay, so we've got a revenue tariff and a protective tariff. Those are depending on the motive here. Now, what we want to note here also is that the War of 1812, okay, so we want to think about this, that the War of 1812, when we think about economic change and economic continuity, okay? So when we think about economic change, that the War of 1812 began a diversification of the U.S. economy and an increase in manufacturing in the Northeast. And yes, that's where we're getting into the market revolution, as far as what we're seeing there. So what we know is the market revolution. So we see here an increase in manufacturing in the Northeast, but the United States continued to have a primarily, so the United States economy continued to be based primarily on agriculture and trade. Okay, so based primarily on agriculture and trade for decades. Okay, so for decades, until the Civil War. Okay, so we definitely have some tension between, this northern economy that's getting into manufacturing and the southern economy that is really becoming more profitable. Now, remember that cotton, during this time, cotton became the nation's largest, so most profitable cash crop. Okay, so partly due to Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Okay, so Eli Whitney's cotton gin. So with that, let me see what I can do here and check my internet speed. Okay, so let me do this. I may be able to go and get back on camera. All right, so looks like they're still not giving me anywhere near what I'm paying for right now, but looks like, okay, I think that we'll probably be able to come back here. So let's see what we've got in terms of things here. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and note here, wasn't Jefferson a big supporter of the French? Okay, so we are still suffering here on the video. Now, is the video interfering with the audio at all? I think that would be one question. I may be a blurry, but if people can hear me okay, maybe it would be better between that. So yeah, differentiating between the two tariffs. Yeah, I think that the economic differences between the North and the South, that's something that's important. Okay, so people can hear just fine. Again, having some internet speed issues, but hopefully those will be resolved. Happens rarely, but sometimes right when you're broadcasting. All right, so with that, we're thinking in terms of Jefferson as Secretary of State was a supporter of the French Revolution, but as far as president, he's at a different vantage point. Okay, so he says, look, the neutrality policy seems to be working, and Jefferson continues Washington's foreign policy, which sets the United States on an independent course regarding Europe. Now, one thing that we might want to note here is when we're thinking about the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so that's something to think about when you're thinking about the Monroe Doctrine, that this is a continuity in Washington's foreign policy, because the Monroe Doctrine is really kind of another sort of cornerstone here of of American foreign policy. So when we think about the Monroe Doctrine, let's go ahead and go back to screen sharing here, and I'll cut the blurry camera off. And so when we look at the Monroe Doctrine, we note that there are revolutions in Latin America at this time. So around 1820, there are, which Mexico declared its independence in 1821. Around 1820, we're seeing these revolutions in Latin America. And so going from there, Europe, a lot of European nations, they're thinking in terms of, we might want to go back in and get those colonies. Okay, so we might want to go in and get those colonies back. And so going from there, we'll want to, what's the United States going to do? And so the Monroe Doctrine issued in 1823, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a great example of, it doesn't matter, 1823, 1820s. Remember, nobody's going to be impressed with you getting the specific year when we have a specific year, when it's open book, open notes, okay, because anybody can look that up. So with that, the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers, okay? So with that, we want to note here that, the Monroe Doctrine becomes a, part of American foreign policy, that really putting some space between us and Europe, where George H.W. Bush in 1988 said, read my lips, no new taxes. And so what's happening here, though, is we're seeing that Monroe is saying, read my lips, no new colonies. And he's serious. Okay, he keeps his promise on that. Now, the United States didn't really have a way to enforce this at the time, but this becomes a very big deal when we get into Teddy Roosevelt. Also becomes a big deal during the Cold War, where the Monroe Doctrine, the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine is invoked, that we don't want European, European forms of government that inhibit freedom to come in and take over in the Americas. So when you look at some of that, but then again, that's not going to be on the exam this year. So as far as that goes, we want to note the legacy is U.S. interventionism in Latin America, basically the Monroe Doctrine expressing solidarity with the American continent, but also for, some U.S. foreign policy kind of marking Latin America as the U.S. sphere of influence, that we don't want Europe intervening in these, in these Latin American countries. So that's something there. Now, the era of good feeling, note that during the era of good feeling, we have a break from political parties, but understand that, that we have a break from political parties, but we don't necessarily have a break from controversy. Okay. So what we want to think about in terms of the era of good feeling is that, you do have some political controversies. They're just not partisan controversies. So you still have political ideologies, but not political partisanship. And so in 1819, Missouri tried to come into the Union, and that causes a big stir. You want to make sure this is one of those things that really begins as far as the road to the Civil War. And so when we think about this, that Missouri, Clay comes in and says, how about we admit Missouri as a slave state? We admit Maine as a free state, and we prohibit slavery in the territories of the Louisiana Purchase north of the 3630 parallel. Deal. Now note that the antebellum period kind of begins in 1820. And this is a time, as I said, that you've got no partisanship, but you've still got some disagreements. And so they come up with a deal, a compromise. Henry Clay helps to strike this compromise. Now, during the antebellum period from 1820 to 1860, what you've got is, that it gets more and more difficult to compromise. That's actually been the subject of a DBQ before, one that I enjoy using in my classroom, that, compromise becomes much more difficult. Okay. So going from there, I think that is going to be about the end of the day for us. So looks like we're coming up on 7:30. And so with that, let's remember that we are going to take a break for the weekend, for Friday and Saturday night. We will not be broadcasting, but I will be back on Sunday, and hopefully with faster internet. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all for joining us. Enjoy your Friday and Saturday, and I will see you again on Sunday, and we will be broadcasting at 6:30 p.m. Eastern all the way through the APUSH exam. It is always a pleasure.